Hello and welcome to this long-term reading project in which we will discuss a section of Thomas Mann's novel The Magic Mountain every week. If this is the first video that you're watching on this channel, I recommend watching my introductory video first in which I describe why it is worth reading this novel, which is more than 100 years old, and also how this project is going to be organized. And of course, I would also recommend to watch the first two videos in which I discuss the first two chapters of the novel. In short, in these weekly videos, I will not give a summary of the respective section, but I will rather assume that you have already read it. But what I would like to do is to share my observations and thoughts with you that have come to me while reading the novel or while doing some research. But I will also put some questions and problems on the table that I had while reading the novel and that you may be able to help me with. In the past 2 weeks, we have read chapter 3 of the novel, and after the second chapter gave us a flashback to Hans Castorp's past, in chapter 3 we now accompany Hans through his first full day at the Berghof Sanatorium. We had already briefly seen his arrival there in the first chapter, but here in chapter 3, the real initiation begins. The first full day from morning to evening, when Hans gets to know all the rituals and the rules, and also the most important fellow residents or inmates at the Berghof. And I would like to go through my observations of the third chapter in the same order as in the last videos, by addressing the three following topics or questions. First, what more do we learn about Hans and other main characters of the novel in this chapter? Second, what overarching themes are touched in this chapter? And third, what narrative features or tricks have I noticed? I will try to limit myself to those aspects that are new in chapter 3. Of course, the central themes of the novel, such as the situation of society on the brink of the catastrophe and the many contradictions in the character of Hans, all these aspects continue to play a role in the third chapter, and they shimmer through the narrative fabric in many places. But that has already been said in detail in the previous videos, and I'm not going to present the umpteenth example of these aspects. So what do we learn about Hans? I think we see nicely that he vacillates between tradition and modernity. Well, that's not totally new, but I would like to highlight a small example from the first paragraph of the third chapter to illustrate, on the one hand, how densely equipped with allusions to multiple levels of meaning Thomas Mann's prose is, and how difficult it is to treat separately those three aspects: characterization of persons, overarching themes, and narrative devices used. In the first chapter, Hans Castorp mentions that he alternates daily between shaving with a traditional razor knife and with a modern safety razor. So again, he's undecided, and sometimes old-fashioned, sometimes modern. And these safety razors with replaceable razor blades, they came into fashion towards the end of the 19th century. So that were quite new at the time of the novel. And in Germany, in German, they are also called Rasierhobel, which literally translates into razor plane, with plane like the carpenter's tool to smoothen wooden planks. And in the third chapter now, Hans' morning ritual is described nicely, as he covered his cheeks with scented leather and drew over them the blade of his silver-plated safety razor. I'm hesitating because in the German original, it's actually, the key point is that in the German original, the word used here is not safety razor, but it's just Thomas Mann uses the word plane here to refer to the razor. So plane, the same word for this tool, which is used to smoothen wood. So on the one hand, small details like this silver-plated object, and the perfumed foam or leather that reveal the pampered status of Hans. And on the other hand, the short word hobel or plane for a safety razor, which is an unusual choice of words, is also an allusion to a tool used in shipbuilding, so to Hans' own profession. So it's a nice reference also to his profession. But it is also a tool that is depicted in the engraving Melancholia I by Albrecht Dürer as a symbol a symbol of melancholy. In the German dialogue video that I did with Jürgen last week, I'd already pointed out that this engraving of by Albrecht Dürer from 1514 had a very special meaning for Thomas Mann, and that he had been intensively studying this engraving for many years. He had also described it in detail in his later novel, Dr. Faustus. And also the novel The Magic Mountain is full of allusion to the symbolism in this engraving. Almost all the symbols for melancholy that are in this engraving are also quoted somewhere or referred somewhere in The Magic Mountain. And this is one example is this mention of this plane. It's a wordplay which does not work that well in the English translation, I'm afraid, and that's why I'm explaining what words are used in the German original, which is instead of safety razor, the German word for plane, which is referring not only to the shipbuilding profession but also to this symbol, this tool, as a symbol of melancholy. Okay, moving on to things that are a bit easier to explain. I think what we also see nicely is that Hans is prudish to the point of ridicule. He is scandalized, or he feels scandalized by the love play of the Russian couple in the next room, and he finds it outrageous that they are not doing this in the dark of the night, but in broad daylight. And the narrator describes his facial expression of drawing the veil as not quite original or not quite native. In other words, also in his moral outrage, Hans is absolutely average, a mediocre person of his time. So we notice that he is a bit spoiled and he loves luxury, especially when it enhances his physical well-being. So he uses lavender soap, he powders his face after shaving, he has red Saffiano slippers and so on. So he is a real sensitive soul, and the narrator, for example, speaks of a natural idiosyncrasy. And the German word idiosyncrasy, which Thomas Mann used here, is a rare foreign word in German today, and even at the time, a very sophisticated highbrow word, and even a word indicating somebody who has a high level of sensitivity. Hans has a tendency to block out or to ignore things that make him feel uncomfortable or unpleasant. So he explicitly does not want to get to know his Russian neighbors. He doesn't want Joachim to introduce him to them because he probably still feels ashamed of having been witness to this, to their love scene early in the morning. And Hans, I think, still is an unfinished character. He is still searching for his identity. He is probably yearning to define himself by forming part of a group. At least one can guess so when he encounters the club, the Half-Lung Club, who seems so infectiously cheerful to him that, quote, made one almost wish to be of their lively party. Moving on, I think that Hans' monologue about the pleasures of smoking is extremely revealing. Smoking, this idle act of leisure and pleasure, is the main meaning of life for him. A day without smoking, life without smoking seems meaningless and empty to him. And so he has no intrinsic motivation for anything active and positive. He has a lot of freedom from obligation, from constraints, from financial worries, but he does nothing with this freedom. He does not use it. He does not shape it. I think we will deal with the concept of freedom in more depth as the novel progresses, and with these two different phases: an immature and purely negative form of freedom, freedom just as freedom from something, or as the opposite, as something of a more mature freedom, freedom for something. That is, the freedom to do something or to create something. I think this will be one of the more philosophical topics that the novel will invite us to explore, also in a self-reflective manner. But enough about Hans. What do we learn about the novel's other main characters? First, of course, there is Hans' cousin Joachim. I find the contrast between Joachim and Hans remarkable in terms of maturity of the characters. Joachim is not yet a soldier at all, but he has already internalized military language, military habits, military virtues. He has a clear set of values and ideals, and he consistently implements these. And in contrast to this, Hans, who is almost an engineer, he has already completed most of the training and study for his profession, but he has not yet internalized any of the sober and determined work ethics that is normally associated with the engineering profession. In this chapter also, the clinic director, Dr. Behrens, makes his first appearance, and to me, he seems a little bit opaque. On the one hand, he seems to be honestly concerned about the patient's well-being, but he crosses the boundaries of decency. For example, by examining Hans' eyes without asking or without warning. His tone of voice in the conversation with Hans and Joachim swings back and forth between the sophisticated conversational tone of an educated man addressing another educated man, and the military command tone of the parade ground. And sometimes he seems very rather cynical and brash, but not really tangible. And for me, a similarly unclear impression remains as after Hans' first conversation with Dr. Krokowski, where Hans also cannot assess whether Dr. Krokowski is friendly or annoyed. I think this is along the line of the medics, the doctors, as a sort of deities or semi-gods. And I think what characterizes gods is also that they are unpredictable. You can never fully understand them and their ways of thinking and acting. And I think the Dr. Behrens, Dr. Krokowski have some of this atmosphere around themselves of being unscrutable. Okay, and then there's Lodovico Settembrini, who makes his first and second appearance in this chapter. Also a very ambivalent character, I'd say. He's an impoverished intellectual, a humanist with pedagogical tendencies, who would like to become Hans' mentor, and who is of Italian origin but speaks an extremely precise and vivid German, who is witty but also has a very malicious sense of humor. And Joachim seems to have tremendous respect for Settembrini. I think he is downright embarrassed to be surprised by Settembrini while Hans laughs a little foolishly. And Settembrini seems contradictory to Hans. He makes him think of a hand organ man or an organ grinder, that is, of a wandering vagabond who has a bit of an air of the exotic about him, but who mechanically always plays the same tune and always appears at an inconvenient time and asking for small change. And the narrator even uses the word Satan in both sections of chapter 3 that tell us something about Settembrini. And I think this needs to be explained a little bit. So I have thought a lot about why is Settembrini introduced so ambiguously by the narrator and with this label of a Satan. And I think to answer this, we have to go back to what has already been mentioned a few times. The Magic Mountain was not only written in a time of external upheaval, but its composition also coincides with a time when Thomas Mann himself had made a 180-degree turn in his own political stance and position. From the ultra-reactionary nationalist hawk of 1914, who despised the liberal and the politically more progressive men of letters, who stood up for liberal democratic values, such as his own brother Heinrich. He despised this sort of people. And then he changed to a convinced Democrat and a strong advocate of liberal values from around 1920 onwards. And this change did not happen overnight. And Thomas Mann did not make it easy for himself, but he really fought an inner struggle for years to find the right position. And in the Magic Mountain, he does not present us just with a finished and polished end result, but he shows the reader in a very honest way this inner struggle and also his previous immature positions and the change in his own worldview. And at the beginning of World War I, or shortly before, in the first month of work on the Magic Mountain, these newfangled ideas of Ludovico Sembrini were still an absolutely suspect position for Thomas Mann. Perhaps subliminally already attractive in some points, like a devilish temptation, but in his conviction, I think his clear conviction was that these values and ideas were pure poison for society. At least in the early stages of writing The Magic Mountain, he thought that this was pure poison and a devilish temptation. And in this, he was not alone, but sadly, he was representative of a large part of German society and German intellectuals, and also intellectuals in many other European countries who had this more nationalist way of thinking. But Thomas Mann did not gloss over this in retrospect, but he left it recognizable in the novel that there was a time when the ideas, the progressive ideas of Mr. Settembrini must have seemed like the devil's work to the narrator and to his contemporaries. And I think it's also important to note that the Satan alluded to here, however, is not the Christian Prince of Darkness, but also not the droll caricature of a devil that is used by rebellious teenagers who smear gravestones with pentagrams and number 666 and who wear provocative t-shirts from heavy metal bands depicting a few skulls and crosses upside down. No, it's not that sort of Satan. What Satan is representing here is the purely worldly attitude of reason as an alternative to an attitude that relies on blind obedience to divine laws or supposedly divine laws. So instead of blindly believing an emperor, a Kaiser who claims to have his power by the grace of God, one's own thinking and one's own reason becomes the ultimate benchmark. And this attitude is associated with Satan here. And this, I think, was also made clear by the quotation from the Italian author and philosopher Carducci that Settembrini quotes or declaims here. O saluto, Satana, o ribelliono, o forza vindice della ragione. It means in English, hail Satan, rebellion, power of rebellion, vengeful power of reason. So it's Satan as a representative of human reason versus divine revelation or divine laws. And Settembrini also makes this clear when he presents himself as the representative of reason. At one point he said, somebody must have some esprit or some reason. It depends on the translation. He says that about himself. And like the devil or the serpent in the Garden of Eden, who whispers to Eve, did God really say that? You should not eat the fruit from this tree? Did God really say that? So the same way, Settembrini is also the one who sows doubt and presents other alternative perspectives and interpretations. So, for example, he casts doubt on the integrity of Dr. Behrens, calling him a fowler, and citing many examples of greedy clinic directors. And he gives malice a completely different evaluation. In classical Christian thinking, malice is more of a sin, a vice. But Settembrini, he praises it to the skies, and he virtually glorifies it. He says, I quote, "In my eyes, it is reason's most brilliant weapon against the forces of darkness and ugliness. Malice, my dear sir, is the animating spirit of criticism, and criticism is the beginning of progress and enlightenment." So, but Settembrini is not just a dry, ossified intellectual. He is also receptive to feminine charms, and so he whistles after the village beauties like a philanderer. So he is a very colorful and somewhat elusive, ambivalent figure. He is fascinating on the one hand, but perhaps also a bit dangerous for Hans and his soul. It's not yet fully clear. We'll see. Shortly after Settembrini, we meet Mr. Albin, and this is somewhat eccentric, superficially fearless young man who comes across more as an uncouth lout, and in this respect is already a massive contrast to Settembrini. And I believe that Mr. Albin's wordy entrance at this point in the novel is not without reason, but rather a deliberate choice by Thomas Mann as a deliberate contrast to Settembrini, and to prepare or to emphasize another turning point in Thomas Mann's thinking. We have already touched on the fact that the Magic Mountain also marks a turning point in Thomas Mann's attitude towards death. After the longing for death and sympathy for death, and the lack of perspective that runs through the whole novel, Death in Venice. It's not a novella, it's a novel, it's a novella. Sorry. After all that, the Magic Mountain marks a stronger turn towards life, a more optimistic position. But also, again, this does not happen overnight either. And not at the beginning of the novel. It is the result of Hans Castrop's 7-year toiling with this topic. And so I think it's only logical that after the appearance of Settembrini, who stands more for the future thinking of Thomas Mann, for the life-affirming and progressive, shortly after that, as a sort of a counterbalance, the melody of death is sung again as a counterpoint, musically speaking. Okay, with that we have already made the transition from the characters of the novel to the big themes of the novel. And I don't want to say much more about death, only that this third chapter naturally also contains many allusions to death, both overt and hidden. Some of them are overtly there in the description of hopeless cases and the last rites. The last unction, it's called, or extreme unction, the premonitions of evil, such as the macabre saying tous les deux by this one woman clad in black who is mourning her 2 sons, or the blood-colored tea in the dining room. We also see classic traits of an initiation rite in the chapter. It is, after all, Hans' initiation or introduction to this completely new parallel world. And Hans himself also feels it. I quote, "He was tense and nervous, as a young man is when about to present himself before strangers." So he feels some of this stage fever, the nervousness before entering into a new life, into a new world. And then there is this great theme of melancholy. I don't want to list all the references here, but just give a few hints and invite you to discover further references in the novel yourself. Just a few pointers, so to say. Thomas Mann was deeply involved with the theory and representation of melancholy in art and in cultural history. And I have already mentioned Dürer's engraving Melancholia I with its symbols, almost all of which appear in this novel. And in the ancient doctrine of temperament, which was very popular in the 16th century when Dürer made this engraving Melancholy, melancholy was thought to be related to an imbalance of bodily fluids, especially a lack of blood and an excess of black bile. And this was associated also with signs of the outer appearance, like dark skin and anemia, were indicative of an excess of bile and a lack of blood. That is an indicator of melancholia. Restless sleep and chaotic dreams were associated with melancholy. And furthermore, in Greek and Roman mythology, melancholy was associated with the god Kronos and the god Saturn. And Saturn liked to eat a lot in company. Let's think of the description of all the meals taken in the third chapter. And the symbol of the god Kronos is also the snake that bites its own tail. And Kronos is also the ancient Greek word for time. I think so. There's also a cross-reference between melancholy and time. And I think with these references in mind, you can find a whole lot more of references and allusions to melancholy in the text. There are other allusions and references to mythology. For example, Settembrini refers to Dr. Behrens and Dr. Krokowski as Minos and Rhadamant or Rhadamanthus, who in Greek mythology were the guards or judges at the entrance to the realm of the dead. So Hans' journey on the Magic Mountain is paradoxically not just a journey up the mountain, but it's also a journey downwards, a journey into the realm of the dead, into Hades. And this is also, I think, mentioned by Settembrini, this paradox, in the final section of the third chapter. And this elevation of the doctors to an almost religious level can also be found elsewhere. And I think another example where it now borrows from Jewish and Christian tradition and iconography is where it's described that in the dining room, at the head of each table, a place remains empty because it is reserved for the doctors. And this is, of course, reminiscent of the representation of the Christians' Lord's Supper with Jesus at the head of the table and all his disciples around him. Or also of the Jewish tradition of always keeping a place for the prophet Elijah at the Seder meal. Elijah or Elijah, I don't know how it's pronounced correctly. For those who are familiar with the tales and the stories of the Old Testament, it may be interesting that Elijah is also a prophet who has a very special relationship to the mountains. It's a place of refuge, but also of divine revelation. But it's not all about mythology and religion. There are also allusions, reference to fairy tales. In the dining room, for example, an extremely nimble dwarf serves the meals. And I think this is reminiscent of the fairy tale Dwarf Knows by Wilhelm Hauff, one of Thomas Mann's favorite fairy tale authors, where Jacob, as a dwarf, has to serve in the kitchen of the fairy Kräuterweiß for 7 years. Or also the fairy tale of the Grimm brothers, the wishing table, may be seen as a reference here, and particularly in the dining room scenes. And then what I find astonishing is the emphasis on bodily aspects. Although The Magic Mountain is often told of as a highly intellectual novel, in the third chapter the focus is all on the body and on body functions. The day consists mainly of the performance and control and monitoring of bodily function, but rather of a more passive, animalistic nature: eating, lying down, digesting, taking temperature. And when the physicality of the human being is mentioned, it is done in an almost technical way. It seems really like the mechanization of the human being. For example, the Hermine Kleefeld has to be refilled every 8 days, or Hans is asked, Joachim suggests Hans to ask Behrens to be partially shut down. So we're like talking about a machine here. And during a walk to Davos, Hans says that in the bodies of the dead, physical and chemical processes still take place. And he also uses sort of factory vocabulary here, namely that, I quote, that there is a lively business in the corpse. But at the same time, there are also some first hints of a more philosophical and speculative considerations about the dualism of body and soul. So, for example, do mental processes have an influence on physicality, on bodily functions, or vice versa? So, for example, when Hans speculates about the cause of his heart palpitations. So, a part of going back to all this mythology and religion, even if the Magic Mountain is depicted or pictured like a mythical place, it is not at all a holy place, but it's an absolutely secular, worldly place. And I think we can see that this parallel world is full of human weaknesses and vanities. It's full of gossip, of juicy rumors, of envy, and really hollow, shallow chatter. And just think of all the vulgar chatter of Frau Stör. The most entertaining thing about all her prattle is the mentioning of her 28 fish sauces, just because of the symbolism of the numbers, because 28 is 4 times 7. Even Settembrini comes up with malicious anecdotes about greedy clinic directors, and he sows the first seeds of doubt about the integrity of the entire sanatorium system and the integrity of the doctors. And at least I couldn't help feeling uneasy at some points. I was wondering, is this all just theater and staging? And is there really an interest for that the patients really get sane again? Or is the system built on them being there in the sanatorium forever and spending a fortune? And I think also Hans and Joachim actually use the phrase behind the scenes or behind the curtain, depending on the translation, to describe how dying and death are dealt with, and how the corpses are handled. Okay, and of course the big issue of time is raised, not just in the scene with the 7 minutes temperature measurement, but we also have a nice paradox mentioned in another place where Joachim talks about the half-lung club. They are young people, and time doesn't matter to them, and then they may die. I was thinking, how paradoxical is that? Especially the nearness of death should make time particularly important for these young people as a scarce and precious resource. And Joachim says that time has no relevance for them. So what kind of perversion or inversion of normal values do we have here? And there's also some other hidden and sometimes overt reference to the subjectivity of the sense of time and space when it is said, I quote, "A path that we are walking for the first time is significantly longer than the same path when we already know it." And it's mentioned that we make assumptions about time that we cannot verify. Does it pass evenly or not? Or we measure it with references to other quantities like space, and it's not clear whether this is appropriate at all. And to us today, all this thinking about the relativity and subjectivity of time may seem quite normal and nothing special. But I think we should not forget that these dialogues take place in the year 1907. And it was just 2 years earlier, in 1905, that Albert Einstein published his relativity theory that first questions the fundamental understanding of the concepts of time and space and mass and light and speed. So these ideas of the relativity of time were really hot topics, were very new to the people at that time. Oh, and I think Hans actually lost his sense of time on the very first day. In the section Satan Makes Proposals That Touch Our Honor, Hans says, I quote, "Good Lord, is it still only the first day? It seems to me I've been up here a long time, ages." End of quote. And yeah, this first day ends with Hans not just being confused about the time, but really in a sort of delirious state. And I think also we readers are a little bit confused. Our head and Hans' head, we are spinning. And the chapter closes with Hans having an attitude that can almost be read as sort of a capitulation. He refers again to the feeling he had at school when he was young, and when it was clear that he would not be able to pass on to the next year, but would have to repeat class. And he had this liberating feeling. Now nothing matters anyway. So so he lets himself go down, and he's experiencing the same feeling now. He lets himself go down with relief at the end of this chapter. There's still something going on in the back of his mind. The Russian lady seems to have stirred up some unusual feeling in Hans, and she accompanies him in his dreams. And the symbols in this dream, as far as this young Russian lady is concerned, I think they really demand a psychoanalytical interpretation. And Hans seems to be aware of this and to recoil from it, since he wants to save himself. He wants to escape in his dream from Dr. Krokowski and his dissection of the soul, like how he uses to phrase or to psychoanalysis. Okay, to conclude my observation, after this 40 minutes of talking, a few remarks about the narrative means I observed. The first thing that strikes me is what I would call the aestheticization of even trivial processes. Small activities such as shaving, lighting a cigar, taking temperature are described in very much detail. Not like everyday activities, but almost like sort of rituals that are celebrated. And in addition, of course, what adds to this is that Hans Castorp uses noble equipment for most of these activities. And I think this has two functions. On the one hand, it makes the atmosphere of such scenes much more tangible to the reader. And on the other hand, they also serve as an aesthetic, almost philosophical purpose, which is closely related to Thomas Mann's Nietzschean attitude, which we explained in more detail in the German video together with Jürgen last week. Just in a nutshell, according to the German philosopher Nietzsche, who was very important for Thomas Mann, the world is only bearable through artistic or aesthetic transformation. So the ability to create and to beautify the world artistically, this is where all human dignity lies. And this is a sort of philosophy that, Thomas Mann was deeply rooted in. And I think this he also applied to the way how he describes even the everyday activities. And what also stands out is throughout the whole chapter is the systematic juxtaposition of opposites, always trying to find an equilibrium. It's always a balancing act. The rather funny appearance of the half-lung club on the hiking trail is directly contrasted with Joachim's description of how he saw this death scene, or how the final unction was transported to this patient, Barbara Huyos. And the first encounter with Settembrini as a progressive advocate of the positive, of life, is contrasted with the nihilistic death wish or death defiance of Mr. Albin, and so on. And I think there are both old and new leitmotifs in the novel, in this chapter. Of course, the number 7, the magic number 7, runs through the entire chapter, sometimes openly, as in the number of tables, or the duration of the temperature measurement, sometimes more hidden, as in the 28 fish sauces of Mrs. Sturr. A new leitmotif seems to be the comparison of Settembrini with an organ grinder. So there's this mixture of fascination with the exotic on the one hand, and on the other hand, this slight annoyance by someone who always turns up at the wrong time and always plays the same tune in a mechanistic way. And this is mentioned several times in this chapter, and I think this will pop up in the future as well. And finally, let's take a look at a very small detail, but just as an example of how fascinating Thomas Mann's writing is, and what minimalist means he uses to direct the reader's gaze and provide subtle insight into Hans Castorp's inner life. When Hans Castorp is in the dining room again, and he is again annoyed by this slamming door. He glances up and he sees Claudia Schoscha for the first time, and he follows her with his eyes until she reaches her seat. And while he is watching her, take a look at how she is described, how she changes in his perception from a lady to a woman to a girl, or a schoolgirl, depending on the translation. And a similar transformation occurs when Hans observes her hands. They change from the hands of a lady to the hands of a woman to the hands of a schoolgirl. And this a small detail, a subtle shift of nuances in the words used, easy to overlook, but I'm sure that this transformation of Madame Chauchat from a lady to a schoolgirl in Hans' perception, I think this will have a meaning later in the novel. I'm sure about that. And I find this a very nice example of Thomas Mann's mastery in using very small details to build a great and a profound effect. So I will stop here today. I'm looking forward to your comments, and I hope you will join me again for the next video, which will go online today week, so Sunday the 8th of September. And the next video will cover the first 4 sections of chapter 4. That is, until and including the section politically suspect. So if you feel bored in the meantime, feel free to drop by my main channel. For those who don't know it yet, it's called Polyglot Reading. I leave a link there. I put it in the info box below. And I'm confident there will also be a new video release on my main channel next week. Okay, thanks for watching this video. Have a great reading time. Take care. Bye-bye and ciao.